All right. Well, welcome back to Brass Tactics. So far, we're hoping that Pete Maverick Mitchell can join us. But in the meantime, we welcome back our friend Matt after a long extended hiatus, doing primary research and dealing with real world problems, and not a podcast that is amounting to zero additional dollars for any of your hosts involved. This one is not directly about the counteroffensive in Kursk, though we'll talk about it. But I mean, Ukraine is the soup du jour, and we are learning so many fascinating things from it. And so this will be another installment about the Ukraine war, and this one's going to be some speculation on our end, our 2 cents on how we think this is going to end. Now, Matt, just to catch you up from last time, one of the biggest takeaways that we were speculating on in the two-part series we just did on the Kursk counteroffensive is that some of the strategy behind this was probably to upset Russia, upset the lines in the sand Russia drew, so that if the international community decides to try and pressure a stalemate along the lines of like freeze the lines where they're at now, well, Russia will embarrassingly have lost strategically potentially insignificant, but still a substantial swath of its own sovereign soil to Ukraine. And so that's sort of put a wedge in that plan is where the speculation went. But the Kursk offensive, we also speculated like we took this whole it's similar to anti-access area denial. What we've seen the artillery, we've seen the air defense artillery, we've seen these drones and electronic warfare all integrated to basically control a bubble around your battle space. And you are the law in that area. And that's why we haven't seen a whole lot of maneuver in the past year and some change, because it is lethal to step into somebody else's bubble. And what we saw was Ukraine found a weak spot in Russia's line and took this bubble and made it maneuverable. And so we speculated at the end of our last series that Ukraine was testing this like in practice, right? Where else is Russia weak that we can make these incursions and make similar strategic gains and potentially finally force them to start really peeling off some of their decisive elements from the southern and eastern fronts over there in order to deal with this and sort of alleviate pressure on that end of the battlefield. And two, just testing out this new form of combined arms operations, this new form of taking this area denial, anti-access, and complete control bubble on the move. And so, just with that sort of repinged, what's next in this war, and how many next things are coming before this war is concluded?
Well, I mean, just to start off with what you said there, Joe, I mean, you and Pete made some great points last week. I think one of the other things that's worth bringing up about the Ukrainian counteroffensive is just the red lines. You mentioned it, but it's the whole "I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you" thing. How far can you push Russia before they do something? And you have certain governments that are terrified of whatever move Russia might make next. And if you take Russia's sovereign territory, occupy it, and say it's ours now, that's crossing a pretty big red line. And last time I saw, Kiev hasn't eaten a nuclear weapon, so that red line might not be as much of a red line as Russia said it was before. And additionally to that point, it gets into the how does this end? It goes without saying, even for the most optimistic Ukrainian, pro-Ukraine analysts out there, it's highly doubtful that Ukraine will take back its territory prior to 2014, let alone what it's lost so far in the Russian invasion that started in 2022. It's Russia has too many troops in Ukraine. The defensive lines are too thick. That was seen with the counteroffensive last year that went basically nowhere in the Torets direction. They got maybe 15 kilometers before it ground to a halt, and the Surovikin line was too much of an obstacle for the Ukrainians to overcome at that point. So I think going back to the Russian incursion in the Sumy region, it's a political bargaining chip. If I have something that matters to you, I can get back something that matters to me. And it plays into how does this end. And you go into a few scenarios, and we can talk about them. Negotiated settlement is probably the most likely course of action, with catastrophic Ukrainian collapse and catastrophic Russian collapse being less likely options somewhere along the scale with potential segues and sequels to each one of those.
Yeah, because one of the things I think we talked about in one of our earliest episodes, there's Russia has poured manpower and money into this. And so it's hard to envision a scenario where Russia concludes this war with an ending where they don't save face. They seem committed to make sure that this does not, because this seemed very embarrassing after they made very little progress within the first 4 months, where it just the staunch resistance, the trapped tanks, the poor training. This seemed very embarrassing, and it just seems like that they're holding on until one, that initial embarrassment has been overcome or forgotten, and two, they can't afford at this point. They literally can't afford to have sunk all of this in. It's sunk cost fallacy, right? And come away and not have made some sort of gain, right?
Yeah, a return to 22 borders is unacceptable for them. They have to gain something out of it. And I think over time, you've seen the Russian goals just get revised downwards over the course of this war. I mean, initially it was, we're going to take over Ukraine. It's regime change. And no, we're going to go all the way and we're going to take these regions of Ukraine to, we're going to go to the river to, we're just going to take back the rest of, or not take back, take the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk. And the goals keep getting revised lower and lower for the Russians, but likewise for the Ukrainians as well. It's went from a we're going to take back everything plus what we lost in 2014 to we're going to take back the Kherson region to we're going to just hold the line where it is right now, take a chunk of Russia, and then try to use it as a bargaining chip. And I do think both sides eventually go to the negotiating table. I think that's the most likely course of action. Ukraine's shown that it's not just going to catastrophically collapse. And even if worst case scenario, its Western allies cut off aid, I could see them falling back to the river, but I couldn't see them falling back much further than that. Honestly, there's no way the Russians are taking Kiev, even if aid gets cut off. They've shown an inability to conduct maneuver warfare at the operational level. There's no way, even with overwhelming firepower and manpower advantages, unless they just want to grind in Ukraine for the next 10 years, which I don't even think Putin has the political appetite.
Yeah. What if there is no finite solution? Like these are two very stubborn countries, right? What if the best alternative anybody can hope for here is like a potential perpetual armistice similar to the North Korea South Korea one?
You mean just a ceasefire and no treaty?
Yeah.
I think that's kind of what you had from 2014 till 2022 with occasional outbreaks of low level skirmishing and violence. You could theoretically see a return to that, I guess. I would put that not quite at negotiated settlement, but in that direction. You've made some kind of agreement politically to stop large scale fighting.
And that of course, since the borders are questioned, would at least accomplish Russia's presumed objective, one of Russia's presumed objectives of Ukraine cannot put in a bid for NATO since its territory would still be in question.
A la Georgia 2008, if we just
Yeah.
occupy part of your country and call it ours,
So
unless,
I
oh, go ahead.
no, please continue.
I was going to say, unless you want to unilaterally give up your territory and just resign it to its fate, which Georgia, I guess, could have done, and Ukraine could have done post 2014, that's just unacceptable that you're going to let blatant aggression change the territorial integrity of your country, even if you know you're never going to get the land back. I mean, look at Japan. They lost part of their land to Russia after the end of World War II. I'm sure they'd love to have it back. Russia's not going to give it back. Kaliningrad, that's unless the Russians somehow decide to leave, that stays a part of Russia, even if it's landlocked and isolated. And then the parts of Finland that Russia took after the end of World War II with the treaty they signed with the Finns, East Kerala is never going back to Finland either. Well, once Russia takes something, whether or not it's internationally sanctioned, it's kind of part of Russia forever.
Is Kaliningrad that weird Baltic province?
Yeah, it's on the border between Poland and Lithuania. It's what used to be Königsberg in East Prussia.
Yeah, I think Pete's doing some research on that now. So it's a shame he hasn't joined us yet because I bet there's a hot take he could add there. But yeah, I'm glad you brought up the 2008 Georgia thing because you asked, well, what's next? And it made me think like the next thing I thought was like, well, what's next after next, right? I'm still just baffled that it's just I guess the benefits of having an autocratic society, right? You can decide that 60% of your economy will now just be solely dedicated to reconstituting all of the military that you just keep all the military assets you keep throwing in the meat grinder. It's just so hard for me to personally fathom, but I mean they're over there doing it, so you can't deny it. But then okay, so whether we hit a perpetual armistice again and just go into this just another new decade of will they won't they Ukraine Russia, or they reach an actual formal negotiated settlement, right? So that whatever's next there, what's next after next? Because the whole like self-sustaining cycle Russia has going, like, but its economy is not a closed system as much as it can force it to act like that. Like this bill is going to come due at some point, and when it does, what's going to happen for all these disputed territories that Russia's claimed ownership of? Like I'm certain those Georgian dissidents and separatists did not just simply disappear overnight somewhere between 2008 and 2014. And so what is going to happen next? Whatever is going to happen, I'm expecting a lot of domestic turmoil for Russia, and I'm expecting a whole lot of lack of foreign policy influence in the next few decades.
I think the biggest, I mean, people can draw parallels between Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine and the current ongoing war that began in 2022, or if you go all the way back to 2014. But just the sheer resources expended in the two of them. I mean, Russia barely even got a black eye invading Georgia in 2008. They lost a few of their troops, minor resources, a single Tu 22M strategic bomber that the Georgians got lucky with shooting down, and other than that, it was more or less a pretty clear cut victory for them. Trying to sum the current expenditure of Russian resources in Ukraine is anything but a Pyrrhic victory at this point would be hard to do otherwise. I mean, yes, you can compare them, but what comes next is really how does Russia rebuild from this? Their military is crippled. Yes, they have a lot of combat experience, but are they capable of learning from that? I think one of the biggest issues with the Ukrainians is they don't really do an AAR, or what we would, in the civilian world, an after action review, the way that the U.S. military does. When something goes wrong, we analyze it, we make changes, recommendations, try to avoid that happening again. A good example is Operation Eagle Claw, 1980. Horrible attempt to rescue the hostages held by Iran and against the U.S. over the support for the Shah. And after that, you saw the creation of the Goldwater Nichols Act, the reformation of the Joint Command Structure, creation of Special Operations Command. All sorts of changes came out of that. I don't think you're going to see any changes in the Russian military after this war. And I don't think you're going to see anything that big in the Ukrainian military either. That culture moves very slowly. The Ukrainians move more quickly than the Russians. They've had to, but there's a lot of post-Soviet thought that's still very Soviet command thinking in general, just the way that they process things and the hiding of events. I'll give you an example. This past week, the Ukrainians lost their first F 16. They haven't said yet, but all inclinations indicate that it was a Ukrainian Patriot that shot it down. There was a Ukrainian politician who came out and said that, who was then roundly criticized by the chief of the Ukrainian Air Force for spreading lies, even though that appeared to be the truth. And then that general was relieved, the head of the Ukrainian Air Force, who I can't recall his name at the time, which is surprising that he was actually relieved. But just the lack of ability to, number one, admit fault, and number two, make any changes based upon that. If you think it's bad in the Ukrainian army, should see the Russian army. People get promoted upwards. Just look at General Lapin, who's been behind every Russian failure so far, and just keeps gaining more stars. So I don't know what comes militarily of it in terms of change. Politically, I think it gets played as a victory in Russia. That's the only way Putin can sell it to his own people.
Yeah, I don't doubt that at all, but like one of the things we've talked about before is like victories on the battlefield have to be fungible, right? Like you have to be able to translate that victory into some sort of political gain. And I'm just not seeing what it could be anymore other than grabbing some swaths of Ukrainian territory for grabbing territory's sake. Because I mean, you look at the other political outcomes, what did they do? They got everybody in Europe to stop treating NATO as like a fun social club and start actually contributing along NATO lines. They scared the crap out of everybody who wasn't a NATO member and the NATO members. And now everybody's taking defense very seriously, and they're taking it very seriously in relation to Russia. So like that that cannot that cannot be advantageous to Russian foreign policy moving forward.
No, but I don't think the average Russian citizen cares that much about that. I mean, the average Russian citizen, the fact that Sweden's part of NATO and Finland's part of NATO, in their own deluded minds, think that somehow they could still triumph against them and all of NATO if they really wanted to. I think, in terms of tangible gains for the Russians, they somehow think the Ukrainians are a lesser form of Slav that has now been integrated into Rodina, Mother Russia, everything else. You have some gains, not a lot, but when you're an authoritarian dictatorship, you can make some very minor territorial gains seem like you just won the Second World War all over again. It's the second great patriotic war. The fact that we have a land bridge from Mariupol to Crimea or something along those lines, and you can
Yeah.
just say that you denazified Ukraine. You went in and you declared victory and you won. It's like the U.S. invading the Kuwait, liberating Kuwait in the Gulf War in '91. Did we accomplish regime change? No, we didn't take out Saddam, but we declared victory and left. Different scope, different comparison, bad apples to orange comparison, but changing your you can always change the narrative whenever you want when you're in charge.
Yeah, I guess I don't really think about the Russian populace, Russian domestic audience really having much agency or weight in general, just because I assume whatever they hear is always filtered through the Kremlin, and and so they just if they had an opportunity or an interest to wield their domestic opinions into their foreign policy the way that democracies and republics like the United States work, I don't ever see that actualized very much. So I guess I don't really think about the ramifications at the home front for this because I think you're right. I think Putin just needs enough to say, yeah, we won, and so they'll just be like, yay, we love Putin. But like, what could Putin or Putin's successor actually do with the outcomes of this war? I'm just not seeing anything. I don't see a grand plan here. But Pete, welcome on. Sorry you were late.
Sorry for being late.
We briefly mentioned the Kaliningrad question earlier.
That
So
is
we
a good
might
one.
end up circling back to that. But yeah, so Matt and I have been talking about what's next, right? So we speculated on what tactics or operations we could see the Ukrainians and Russians trying, based off of what we saw from the Kursk offensive. And here we've been talking about how is this war going to end, and then depending on how it ends, or regardless of how it ends, what is the state of what is the geopolitical state of the world after this?
Yeah. I think however it ends up for Russia, they'll just end up. All right, if that picks up. I think no matter what happens for the Russians geopolitically, they will be completely tied to China in a way that basically resembles vassalage, because they won't be able to do anything economically or geopolitically without essentially support, either I say tacit or open, from the Chinese. They're they're
Yeah,
just they're just North Korea on a bigger scale.
that's part of what I was building up to as well. Like it's like one of the things of just like sitting over here in the Democratic Republic of the United States. I just can't fathom somebody up top saying, all right, 60% of our economy now is just solely dedicated to reconstituting military power.
Yeah.
And then just keeping that going in perpetuity. Like, somebody's going to pay that bill later. And obviously, what you're saying is China's basically picking up this tab, and with it, it's picking up the lead strings for Russia. And that
Mhm.
kind of answers my question, like, where's Russia going to be after the conclusion of this war, regardless how it ends? It sounds like very, very solidly inside of China's shadow, which might be a good time to bring up in the larger context. China's trying to cast a very big shadow. We haven't talked about it before, but there's an acronym for this counter, not counter NATO, but counter America and its friends club, called the BRICS. And it's just an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. It's been an acronym for a few years, but it seemed to be getting some traction and worth attention now. And what China's trying to do is China's trying to rewrite China as the leading economy in the world, and everybody who should take economic cues and follow trading rules, policies, and SOPs according to China.
So, sorry though, I'd like to really quick dial back to what you were referring to with Russia's GDP now essentially fully turned onto a planned war economy, and the
Yes.
vast amounts of expenditures that they're having to deal with. The Germans in the late 1930s were also undergoing a similar planned economy built around a war economy, and their actual plan was, at least according to multiple historians, Adam Tooze, Richard Evans, and also Richard Overy, who all wrote books on this in the early 2000s, that the Nazis actually planned to essentially fund their deficit through plundering other countries, to which they had great success in Czechoslovakia and also France, but a lot less success in Poland. And then obviously the constituent socialist republics of the Soviet Union, the Baltic states, Belarus, and Ukraine, because they were dirt poor. The Russians, I think, are having a similar problem. They're not able to actually plunder much out of Ukraine because, despite whatever Dmitry Medvedev is ranting about on Twitter now, Ukraine's mineral resources are mostly locked away below ground, and they're not stealing enough yachts and enough of Zelensky's cocaine apparently to make this worthwhile. So the concern of the Poles and of the Balts, and I think also of the Finns, is that if Russia wants a wealthy, rich target to continue funding its war machine, it needs to look further west, not south toward Georgia or toward Moldova or anything like that. It needs to look toward Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, because those are wealthy and they're relatively vulnerable compared to everybody else. When you have a massive war economy with a military behind it, you kind of need to use it. Otherwise, you're going to lose it. And the Eastern Euros definitely believe this, and I think their main job is trying to convince the French and the Germans that this is highly likely.
Yeah, I mean, going back to Ukraine, like you said, the resources are tied up underground there. I think the biggest win for the Russians now is just going to be able to say that Ukraine will never join NATO, Ukraine will never join the EU, which honestly the
Yeah,
Russians could have accomplished via soft power originally. I mean, if they had continued to subvert and influence Ukrainian elections, I'm sure they could have accomplished that. They've done it in Georgia post 2008 as well without
yeah.
any more military resources.
I
So
think it's Moscow. I think it's Moscow moving the goalpost, Matt. Right? Because they couldn't get the conquest that they were planning, and so now they're like, "Oh, well, we'll fall back on that." So now that's what we're trying to get for a victory condition.
So, Pete, while we still have a little bit of time left, just to sort of backtrack to the central question, because we did not get your input at the beginning.
Oh, sorry
How
about
did
that.
how does this war end?
Jeez Louise. I mean, I think a lot is contingent on the election. I think both sides are playing for time for the US presidential elections. And the Russians, I think, are praying that uh, that Trump wins and that he's like basically the dovish, I guess, best case scenario for the Russians. Essentially, kind of forces the Ukrainians to take a peace and kind of like basically freeze in the front line. Presumably, I'm guessing making the Ukrainians give up Kursk or something like that, or just straight up freeze in the front line. And in response, giving them what Matt was saying, right? Like, don't let them join don't let them join NATO, don't let them join EU. That would fulfill Russia's present demands. I don't know. We're on what, year 2.5 of the war now? I think the Ukrainians have another year and a half maybe left in them. They are Slavs, and Slavs are really, really tough. So I don't really know how. I mean, the breaking point, you can't really point at it because you'll never know when a country's about to crack.
So you seem to be implying that Ukraine being on the losing end is inevitable. Because
No,
you
I don't
said
think so.
if Trump if the presidential election doesn't go Trump's way, you started speculating like, okay, well, the Ukrainians have about a year and a half ish, give or take, more fight left in them because they're
If
tough.
I would say if things continue the way they are, but I think if the Ukrainians start losing ground further and losing the initiative, I think we'll start seeing, especially from the polls, additional backup and guarantees, like these constant crossings of the red line. I mean, shoot, I mean, Macron was already proposing in early summer to send French troops in to guard the border with Belarus to free up more Ukrainian troops. The Poles could very easily do that, and then basically dare the Russians to do something about it. So that I think there's something like that. So like if the things start pushing and the Russians start getting too far, there'll be additional backup guarantees from the Eastern Europeans to prevent them from collapsing. I don't see the Russians quitting though. It's kind of like an unstoppable force beats an immovable object, right? When you have East Slavs fighting each other, these wars are really, really nasty. And short of some kind of catastrophe happening, I don't, as in like an internal thing, like Russia's not going to collapse. Like it's not going to collapse from hardships or economic sanctions or anything like that. And as uh, many people have pointed out, wiser than me, if Putin goes away, somebody worse than him could take over. Way worse, who's not as predictable. So how could it end? Uh, I mean, I think the most likely thing that will be happening is we'll promise will be like what I would do is I would basically try to get some kind of a ceasefire arrangement with pinky promise the Russians that the Ukrainians don't join NATO and the EU, and then promptly break that like a day after, you know, and then immediately put NATO troops in, and then see what happens there. Put the onus on them.
Yeah, we
But
know that won't happen though.
yeah, I know it won't happen because it's too
But
risky.
you could do it, and you'd probably get away with it.
Yep, you totally get it. Just dare them to do it.
I mean, we already
It's
saw with the invasion of Russia that what's a red line? There's no such thing as a red line with Russia.
mhm. Which is a pretty big danger, I think, that the Russians have done because they've completely, not only I think their conventional deterrent has been exposed as a farce, but their even their strategic deterrence.
I don't think any state actor will ever deploy a nuke, with the exception of Iran and North Korea, with the potential special caveat of if there is nuclear war between
Yeah,
states, it's definitely Pakistan and India.
I would agree. 100% agree. If there's ever that, it's going to
We
be between them.
we should do nuclear politics one of these days. That's always a fascinating trip.
Be a good one. I mean, going back
Mhm.
to Ukraine, and I mean, I would say there's an outside chance. I mean, betting odds very low that either Ukraine or Russia catastrophically implodes and collapses.
Mhm.
You never know when that's going to happen. No one thought that the Soviet Union was going to break when it did, and for that matter, yeah, no one thought Japan was going to throw in the towel in World War II when it did either. You never know when a people reaches their breaking point because you're not inside the inner circle of decision makers. But
Mhm.
I think for the Ukrainians, it would have to be advances on Kiev that they couldn't stop, and I don't see that happening unless Belarus gets full scale involved in the war. I don't think they're going to. Whereas for the Russians, unless you have some, I mean, you saw how fragile it was with Prigozhin's mutiny already. If some third-party actor in Russia all of a sudden decides he needs to be the czar, and you have a Russian civil war, that's enough to break the straw that broke the camel's back. Other than that, I mean, the Russians can mistreat their own troops, beat them, tie them to trees, put them in holes, do horrible things to them. At the end of the day, they're not going to mutiny. So I don't know what it takes to get a Slav to mutiny. I mean, you could treat them worse than you treat a secondhand mule, and they're still going to fight for you.
Yeah, notably, like the Russians don't start mutinying in 17 until the Bolsheviks have essentially thoroughly infiltrated the imperial army thanks in no small part to the amazing policy of the Tsar of putting political dissidents into the front line and arming them to try to get
Yes.
rid of them.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah, I think I agree with you though, Matt. The Civil War thing. I remember reading something how like Putin actually has no successor because that would be a threat to him.
Hmm.
Uh, so because of that, he's extremely isolated at the top, and he's a single point of failure for everything. So it's like you want to live by the based trad dictatorship. You're going to die by the based and trad dictatorship.
You said you because you mentioned somebody worse than Putin came along, and that's kind of what I was thinking. Like, part of the reason why Putin's so scary though is because like he's a force of like his character itself, cult of personality. What do you want? Whatever you want to call it. It's just like, is there another Russian that has that potential? Because I would have presumed that their airplane would have had a mysterious accident like Prigozhin's did.
Yeah, they die of
So I
multiple
feel like
organ failure.
surely anybody would be better than Putin.
I mean, windows, sudden heart attacks, hunting accidents, drug
Right.
overdoses, drownings. These things are really common at the higher circles of Russia. They're
What
just
got Navalny again? Multiple organ failure, leftover Novichok poisoning.
I mean, Medvedev's just a useful foil. I don't think he's a true
No,
success.
Medvedev's nothing. You can see by how he spouts on Twitter that he's kind of outside the orbit. What is it? Ramzan Kadyrov? He's got some charisma, but I think it's limited to Dagestan, and the
I think his
Caucasus.
limit is his liver's going to give out and he's going to die.
In the meantime, though, he is a brutal SOB, and I would not want Kadyrov anywhere near the Kremlin.
I
That would
just don't
be
see a Chechen taking over, but then again, no one saw Georgia enrolling the USSR. So
no. The Russians love putting outsiders in charge. They were quite happy under the Mongols for what 400 years.
All right. Well, so whatever's next for the Russia-Ukraine war, it certainly sounds fairly bleak.
Yeah, may you live in interesting times.
there are no
Louis
happy
Pasteur
endings.
said, "What Eastern Europe has so much history, it's its main export."
I hate saying it for the because I fancy myself definitely on the Ukrainian side. I am with any nation that's invaded by another one, but at this point, I don't see how they get their territory back. I mean, the neighborhood bully took their toy and you beat them senseless, and they're still holding on to it. I mean, what are you going to do?
Yeah, well, and I would say also the territory now is practically worthless. Like the Donbass is it makes Sarajevo look like down like beachfront property at this point. So it's there's the 2.5 years of trench warfare plus another what 7, 8 plus of the frozen conflict there. That no one is even living there or going to be able to live there. And then Crimea is just strategically way too. I mean, they wouldn't be able to hold Crimea, I think, even if they took it, just because of the Russian population and the Tatars. They're too pro Kremlin. So I agree with you. I don't think they're going to get it back. The best they can do is try to fight to get into some kind of defensive alliance, even if it's not NATO. Okay, then they get a mutual defense pact with the Poles. Something that they can provide guarantees for the future.
I think that's their end goal. Honestly, is
Mhm.
okay. We need. How do we stop round three? Who's our?
Mhm.
Who's going to jump in next time?
Yeah. Too bad they gave up their nukes.
Yeah,
We
that is.
promised.
Or there's strategic bombers too.
Yep.
People forget they had a whole bunch of Tu-22Ms, and I think did they have Tu-1? I don't think they had Tu-160s. They might
I
have.
think those were all up at
Angles.
Arkhangelsk. Yeah, Murmansk.
Yeah, I know that they definitely had Tu-22Ms. They might have even had Tu-95.
Mm-hmm.
Gonna
Those
Google
for our
quick.
less enlightened audience, those are long range heavy bombers, kind of roughly to maybe a B-1.
Yep, Ukraine inherited 23 to 29 Tu-95 aircraft after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
And
Those are backfires, right?
pulling this back from the heavy tailspin of Matt and Pete's technical war nerddom,
Yes, yes.
thank you for joining us this week. Next episode, we are actually going to be talking about command and control platforms. It's going to be buzzword week here at Brass Tactics. Brass buzzwords. We're going to talk about C4ISR, CJED, C2, C2, C3, ISR, and a whole bunch of other acronyms that you've probably heard and you're not all that familiar with. Well, we're going to break them all down for you because that is the particular tailspin of nerddom research that I am entering in now, and I will be inflicting that on my co-hosts.
I know C4, but that's just from playing Counter-Strike.
The plastic explosive or the other C4?
I was going to say the plastic explosive, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So the other C4 too. Again, please keep telling your friends about us. When you bring up one of those cocktail convo tips, make sure you heard it from Brass Tactics. Spread the news, spread the love. The more listeners we get that aren't related to us, the higher prospects there are that we can keep doing this in perpetuity. And we might even start sounding interesting again at some point. Who knows?
That'd
Leave
be
us a
great.
good review. Share your links. Talk about us on social media. You can find me on LinkedIn most easily, but we have an Instagram at brass.tactics. And yeah, just let us know if there's anything you want us to cover next. Always happy to hear feedback. Otherwise, it comes a little bit of an echo chamber in here. Talking about random alphanumeric strains that are referencing various pieces of equipment, and I still don't know what a Super Tucano is, but I know they're very popular in Africa. So yeah, thanks for joining us.